Okay, the last lesson that we're going to talk about in complex numbers is dividing and graphing complex numbers. So how we divide complex numbers is we use what's called the complex conjugate. Now the complex conjugate is the opposite of, it says multiplying the same complex numbers but with the opposite sign for I. So the opposite sign for I, for A here, is 5 plus 3I times, and then 1 minus 2I times 1 plus 2I divided by 1 plus 2I. So let's go ahead and look at the example. So here we've got 5 plus 3I divided by 1 minus 2I multiplied by the complex conjugate, which is the bottom of your fraction and the opposite sign. So 1 plus 2I divided by 1 plus 2I. So then we're going to just go ahead and FOIL. So we went ahead and FOILed the top here. So the first is 5 times 1, which is 5. The outside is 5 times 2I, which is 10I. The inside is 3I times 1, which is 3I. And then the last is 3I times 2I is 6I squared, which equals to a negative 6 because I squared is a negative 1. So 6 times a negative 1 is a negative 6. We go ahead and combine like terms. So 5 minus 6 is a negative 1, and 10I plus 3I is a positive 13I. Then we go ahead and do the bottom. And the same thing, we FOIL it. So the first is 1 times 1 is 1. The outside numbers are 1 and 2I, so 2I times 1 is 2I. The inside numbers are negative 2I times 1, which is a negative 2I. And then the last numbers in your parentheses are a negative 2I times a positive 2I, which is a negative 4I squared. And again, I squared is a negative, so negative 4 times a negative 1 is a positive 4. And then we combine like terms. So 2I minus 2I cancel each other out, and then we get 4 plus 1 is 5. So then on the top we had a negative 1 plus 13I, which we got from here, divided by the bottom, which was 5. So your answer is a negative 1/5 over, or plus 13 over 5I. All right, let's go ahead and look over here at example 4, and we'll do this A up here. So we've got 2 minus 3I divided by 3I minus 1. Now again, we have to multiply by the conjugate, complex conjugate, which is the opposite of your bottom number, which is 3I plus 1 divided by 3I plus 1. And then we go ahead and just FOIL. So the top we FOILed. The first is 6I. The outside is 2 times 1, which is 2. The inside is a negative 3I times a positive 3I, which is a negative 9I squared. Again, I squared is a negative 1, so negative 9 times a negative 1 is a positive 9. And then your last numbers are a negative 3I times 1, which is just a negative 3I. Then we go ahead and combine like terms. So 6I minus 3I is 3I. So let's change that. This should actually be 3I. So 6 minus 3 should be 3I. And then 9 plus 2 is 11. So this should actually be 3I. And then over here, we went ahead and FOILed the bottom. So the bottom is 3I times 3I, which is 9I squared. And again, I squared is a negative 1. So 9 times a negative 1 is a negative 9. And then we've got our outside, which is 3I times 1 is just 3I. Our inside, which is 3I times a negative 1, is a negative 3I. And then our last, which is negative 1 times a positive 1, is a negative 1. So 3 and negative 3I cancel each other out. A negative 9 minus 1 is a negative 10. So we have 11 plus 3I, which was over here, divided by a negative 10. So over here it should be a negative, your answer should be a negative 11 over 10 minus 3 over 10I. And that is your answer. Again, our standard form is A plus BI. So that's why we put it into the standard form. So our real number goes first, which is a negative 11/10, and our imaginary number, which has our I, always goes second, so minus 3/10 I. Okay. So now let's go ahead and do example 5, which is a negative 3I divided by 2 minus 4I. So negative 3I divided by 2 minus 4I. Again, to divide it, we need to multiply by the opposite, so the complex conjugate. So you've got 2 plus 4I divided by 2 plus 4I, because over here it was 2 minus 4I. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and here we don't need to FOIL, so we're just going to go ahead and distribute in. So we've got negative 3I times 2, which is a negative 6I, and then a negative 3I times 4I is a negative 12I squared. Again, I squared you multiply by a negative 1, so a negative 12 times a negative 1 is a positive 12. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the bottom. So the bottom you do FOIL. So your first is 2 times 2, which is 4. Your outside, 2 times 4I, which is a positive 8I. Inside, which is a negative 4I times 2, is minus 8I. And then last is a negative 4 times a positive 4I, which gives you a negative 16I squared. So then we go ahead and cancel, combine like terms. 8I and negative 8I cancel out. 4 plus a negative 16, again, I squared is a negative 1, becomes a positive 16, and that becomes a 20. So you've got negative 6I plus 12 divided by 20. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to reduce that. So a negative 6, we're going to go ahead and divide each of those by 2. So 2 goes into a negative 6, a negative 3I. 2 goes into 12 6 times, and 2 goes into 20 10 times. So we have negative 3 over 10 I plus 3 over 5, which gives us 3 over 5 minus 3 over 10I, because we have to put it into the A plus BI form. Okay, the second part of this lesson is on graphing complex numbers. Now, if you see here in our complex plane, we have our horizontal axis, which is our x-axis, is our real numbers, and then our vertical axis, which is our y-axis, is imaginary. Now think for a second, why would our y-axis be imaginary and our x-axis be real? Now, the reason why is because, again, it needs to be put into standard form, and standard form is A plus BI. So here we've got A is always real numbers, and BI is always imaginary numbers. And the X is your 2, and your Y is always imaginary. So that's why your x-axis is real and your imaginary is Y. So let's go ahead. We went ahead and plotted the first 3 points. So if you see here, it's 2 minus 3I, negative 3 plus 2I, and 4I. We went ahead and plotted them here on this graph. So 2 minus 3I. Now the 2 is in the x-axis. So we're going to go over 2, and then the negative 3I is in the y. So we're going to go, oh, we actually should have gone down. So 2 down 3. So actually should be here. Okay. And then our next one is a negative 3 plus 2I. So we're going to go over 3, negative 3, and then we're going to go up a positive 2. And then here we've got just 4I. So we do not go left or right on the x-axis. We simply go up to 4I. Okay? All right, and then the last part about graphing is what happens when you multiply. So we start with certain points. So we start with 3 minus 4I. And what happens when we multiply by I? We multiply by a negative 1, and we multiply by a negative I. So let's see. So we started with 3 minus 4I. So 3 down negative 4. This is our starting point. Now what happens when we multiply by I? So let's see. So I times 3 minus 4I gives us 3I minus 4I squared. I squared is a negative 1. Negative 4 times a negative 1 is a positive 4. So we've got 4 plus 3I. So it should have read 4 plus 3i because it's a plus bi. So we're going to go over 4 on our x-axis and up 3. Okay? So now can you describe what happens? Let's erase this one. So what happens when we multiply by I? This point rotates 90 degrees. So when we multiply original points by I, it's going to rotate 90 degrees. So what happens when we multiply by a negative 1? So a negative 1 times 3 minus 4i. So what we get is negative 3 plus 4i. So then we just go negative 3 plus 4i. So from your original point, it rotates 180 degrees when we multiply by a negative 1. What happens when we multiply by a negative I? So negative I times 3 becomes a negative 3i, and a negative I times a negative 4i becomes a positive 4i squared. That I squared becomes a negative 1, so it becomes a negative 4 minus 3i. So negative 4 minus 3, so it actually should be over here, negative 4 minus 3. And so from your original point, it actually rotates 270 degrees. So you need to know what happens when you multiply by I, what happens to the original points when you multiply by a negative 1, and what happens to your original points when you multiply by a negative I.